At the time I was born, of course, that was part of Laon district. I was born in a place called Tebohe. But I grew up in different parts of the country because my dad was in the prison service. When I was born, he was in Masaka. After he had worked at Luzira, and because my dad was in the prison service. When I was born, he was in Masaka. After he had worked at Luzira and Upper Prison and Mutukula. And by the time I started school, he was in Patiko. And then, of course, he was transferred to Germany. And after that, back to Luzira. And then later, then, So I literally grew up all over the country. I had a lot of interest in reading and writing from quite an early age, much as my parents were not educated. Those days, you didn't really need a lot of education to be able to join the security forces. As I said earlier, my dad was in the prison service, and he had been in the army. He had fought in World War II before he was demobilized, and then he joined the prison service. But in spite of that, I always found the opportunity to actually read, and borrow, simple texts and so on. When I joined the seminary, I actually joined the seminary. In those days, you could actually join the seminary in primary school. I had this great opportunity because there were lots of books. Like during lunch. Lunch was actually divided into two parts. You'd eat your lunch and then go to the recreation room where you either would play a game or games like domino and cards, and all those were allowed, and mueso, or read. I preferred reading, actually. I remember being particularly fond of this encyclopedia. It was a series of books called Finding Out. Yeah, and I loved reading Finding Out, and the series actually spoke about a whole lot of things: history, prehistory, motor mechanics, a whole lot of little things in ways that a child would actually be able to grasp. Yeah, and then, of course, I imagine, now when I look back, I realized that from a very early age I was very observant, and I wasn't really talkative. I was just this very quiet child who would sit in a corner, and of course I'd play, but also I'd be watching, and then what I actually observed was what I'd put down in writing, and I started first by writing, poems and short stories and so on as a little kid in primary school. Before I started writing plays, and then the first novel I wrote, I was actually a secondary school teacher, and that was Fate of the Banished. I wrote this when I was in my late 20s, put it away, revised it when I was 31, and then took it to Fountain Publishers. It had just been set up when I was 32 actually, and then it was published when I was 36. It's a variety of books, because Fate of the Banished is a work of fiction for adults. Footprints of the Outsider is a book of fiction for adults, and both these books have actually been gone on the syllabus, A-level syllabus. Actually, it's Footprints of the Outsider that has stayed longest on the syllabus for 10 years. Fate of the Banished stayed for 5 years, but then both of them ended up being taught at various levels, at universities, both within the country and outside the country, and in international schools. Yeah. And then, of course, there are works of fiction for young people, people in S1, S2, and those who are good enough at English, even upper primary. The Unfulfilled Dream, the Price of Grandma's Love, and then one for little children in lower primary, which actually is a translation of a folktale in my mother tongue, Le Blanc, When Hair Stole Ghost's Drum. But I've also written textbooks. I was part of a team that wrote Fountain Comprehensive English. Yeah, it did quite well, because it was actually bought by the government for distribution to all Uganda's universal secondary education schools in Uganda. and also a dictionary, junior dictionary targeted at East African students. You know, there is something that actually pushes you from deep inside. Is you're not really thinking about the money. You know, all sorts of creativity or innovation. I mean, you're not thinking about the money. Eh? You know, I mean, I remember in an earlier interview, I said, look, I mean, if you're only thinking about the money, why don't you go to Winner Market and start selling tomatoes, for example? Eh? I mean, the cash is there. You sell your tomatoes and then you get your money. Eh? But when you are writing, you're taking a risk. But then there is also something unforgiving about you not writing when you have the talent and you have that drive to write. So that is why, you know, you have people like the late Dr. Tumusime Rusheche, who was a medical doctor, pediatrician, but he still wrote. Because he didn't need to. Yeah? He didn't really need to. Hmm? But if you make the money, that's actually like you know, it's an extra reward. Writing alone is rewarding because, you know, there is something that builds up inside you that you just have to find a way to get rid of. The president, I mean, has written books. The First Lady has written, you know, her autobiography. Yeah, I mean, there's so many people. So it's not really about the money. It's not really about the money. It's about the drive and the talent. There are actually two issues here. I think one is that people don't have the money. And I'm really happy that the country is now headed towards middle income, you know, status. Because, I mean, once we get there, people will actually have sufficient disposable income to be able to afford books that they can read for pleasure. Because now when you talk about books, people are thinking about textbooks. Secondly, there are people who have difficulty, and a lot of people actually who have difficulty reading the kind of English that creative writers use. Because you see, textbook English is straightforward. Physics has its, you know, very clear English. You know, you are talking about this apparatus, you are talking about these steps and so on, simple, clear. But creative writing is different. I mean, I come with my own style. Perhaps the vocabulary is difficult for a whole lot of people and so on. And so there are people who will try and then say, no, I mean, I can't go on with this because I don't understand much of what I'm reading. But there is a lot of hope because, you know, the government has and publishers have actually been involved very much in this, encouraged the use of indigenous languages in schools, and works of literature have been written in a number of indigenous languages, the major ones like Luganda, Lusoga, Runyankore-Chiga, Runyurutoro, Lumasaba, Leblango, my mother tongue, Lebacholi, Lukbarati, Dopadola. And these are actually languages that whose literature you can study all the way to university. That suspense is actually very important. Huh? You know, I mean, whether it's a film, whether it's ironically, a lot of people told me, those who have read my book, so you know, you are very good at creating suspense. And all the way, you know, because I mean, I stop at the end of one chapter, you really will want to find out what happened. What happens next, because of that elements of suspense, and then you read, and then, you know, it's not, there is no rounding off yet, even at the end of the story. For example, in Fate of the Banished, now this guy hands himself over a period after killing his wife's lover. Then what next? Those who have read Footprints of the Outsider and compared it with Fate of the Banished, you know, they tell me that the styles are a little different. Actually, they see a lot more Luo influence, Langonese, and I think that was deliberate on my part in Footprints of the Outsider, because Footprints is historical fiction. Yeah? You know, I mean, Teboho is real. Alaro Prison Farm, there is a prison farm with a name that's quite similar. It's not really Alaro, but it's there. Some of the characters are actually based on people who live there or who have lived there. Teboho Trading Center is there, the church is there, and so on. But of course, I mean, you know, you embellish things, you change things here and there, so that you don't end up writing history. My favorite authors were authors from Africa, both English speaking and French speaking. Actually, like Ngugi Wadeo, you spoke about him. Wole Soyinka had a big impact on me. Chinua Achebe, with these things fall apart, and no longer it is. And then we have people like Senghor, the former, okay, the late, the first actually post-independence president of Senegal. We have people like I forget his name. He was also Senegalese. So they actually all had a big impact, and also Caribbean authors, yeah, and American authors. I think social media has taken attention away from, it has kind of fractured attention, because you see, before social media became really popular. I mean, if you wanted to find out about something, you had to go to very specific sources. I mean, the newspapers. You had to watch TV and so on. But now you find there is information all over the place, it's scattered all over the place, and people's attention, people's focus is kind of fractured, if I may put it that way. And so I think it has had quite a negative impact, because I mean, and people's attention span has become shorter. One of the most important roles of a publishing house, and that is why publishing houses actually have a marketing department, is marketing a book, selling it. Yeah. So that's his role. If you decide, I'm going to self-publish and then market my own books, it's quite difficult, because the market is you are not going to go to all these schools, because that's the biggest market anyway. You're not going to go to all the bookshops and so on. So you actually need to work with the publisher. Yeah. And of course, the publisher, if your book does well enough to earn money, then the publisher pays you royalties. That's how the author gets his money. But sometimes there is what is called secondary rights. If, for example, your book is turned into a film, yeah, you share that money with the publisher. The money that the filmmaker makes. The copyright law has just been passed, and I'm really happy about that. Much as it seems the emphasis, a lot of the emphasis on music, but there is also something to do with books in it, and a lot of people actually don't understand it. I think it's really not that the people are evil. People don't understand copyright. And I suspect it's largely because, you see, in the past, these books came in from the government, and then they were distributed to schools. People didn't really know that there was need for you to buy the books, and then so that the authors could benefit. I remember my own example. I actually complained. I went to a place, somebody told me, look, your book has been plagiarized. That was Fate of the Banished, and I picked up that copy. And I picked up a copy published by Fountain Publishers, and I took it to the police. And the police officer I showed the copies to could not see the difference between the genuine copy and the pirated copy. You see, but now there is now that this law in place, I think the situation is going to improve. When you look at the publication years for most of my books, they were published when I was already working at Fountain as an editor. Yeah, it's only Fate of the Banished that was published before I became an editor at Fountain. But all these other books that I spoke about, apart from my last, the last piece I wrote, which is a Tale of Two Husbands, a short story which was published in Canada, in an anthology of East African literature in 2023. All these others actually I wrote them, and they were published when I was working at Fountain. So I was given that opportunity. There is the Uganda Publishers Association. I think that helped, but then there was a time we tried to set a Writers Association, Uganda Writers Association. And a lot of people actually wanted to come on board, but you know, most of us were young, apart from people like Professor Wangusa. Most of us were young, in our 30s. I think the oldest of us was 40. I was in my, I think, early 40s at that time. But the majority were people in their 20s and 30s. And I mean, they were thinking about their careers and so on. And they just started, you know, going off in different directions. Many of them ended up outside the country. I mean, I'm talking about people like Araj, Beatrice Araj, sorry, no, not Beatrice, Araj Dinyeko, Monica, and others. So we ended up, suddenly we found we could not, even when you called a meeting, it was very difficult for everybody to turn up because we were busy with other things and we were scattered all over the place, not just within the country but outside the continent as well. Yeah. What happens is when you have written your book and you want it to go on the syllabus, you take it to the National Curriculum Development Center where they have that criteria. So they actually assess the book, and the book is given to a team. The last time I checked, the team comprised 6 people. And they'd actually go, and each one will assess your book, prepare a report, award a mark. And then the reports will be compared. Now, if the book succeeded, then it would go in the syllabus. If it failed, it would not. Yeah. For universities, I think it's the various literature, his faculties, you know, they have their own criteria. They're the ones who decide. But so if the National Curriculum Development Center decides, look, your book is not of a sufficient quality, because you see, it's about depth, it's about vocabulary, it's about a whole lot of things, you know. They'll say, no, this book here doesn't qualify for secondary school. They're even the ones who will decide, look, I mean, this would be appropriate for O-level, appropriate for A-level. Chuka was at the time I met him, he was a captain in the UPDF. Yeah. And unfortunately, he passed on in 2023 when he was a colonel, full colonel. He had written a lot of books, and what drew us very close to each other was actually, one, his love for literature. Yeah, he had written he published a book actually before Fate of the Banished was published. For the Fairest, that was the title. You might be interested in finding out. You can check with Fountain whether there are still copies of the book. But then he wrote many other books after that, some of which he self-published. And then secondly, he was a very smart guy, very well read, very interesting talker and so on. And I just assume we actually had a lot in common, much as in terms of temperament we were quite different. Yeah, he was much more outgoing than I am, but also we ended up, because of our interest in literature and our closeness, traveling to different places together. You know, I remember there was a time we traveled to Mbarara. We traveled to West Nile together, and we really enjoyed each other's company. First of all, as I said earlier, I'm actually quite happy about the copyright law that is now in place. But I think the one intervention that the government made, and which I've been really pleased about is you know, its decision to buy these books in bulk. Because you see, once you buy these books and then they go into the schools, yeah, I mean, the kids will read them and they'll say, oh, you know, these books are good. But also, I think there are organizations in this country, you know, so CSOs, companies, they can also, you know, come in and say, look, I mean, can't we buy these books and distribute them to the schools? I mean, MTN has a lot of money. I think this is something that they should think about. First of all, we should have the libraries in our homes. And, and then secondly, you see, when you read, your child will read. When you don't, your child will not read. And one thing I've noticed is people don't really attach a lot of importance to reading for pleasure. Yeah. And yet it's important. It's important. I mean, you can watch football. Girls can, of course, watch TV, you know, I mean. But you can find time to read. There is a way in which your character can actually be transformed through reading. A way in which your mind gets broadened. You see things differently. A way in which you actually visit other places without getting on a plane or on a ship or on a bus to travel there. A way in which your vocabulary broadens. Mm? You know, so it's there are so many different advantages that you can derive from reading for pleasure, and it spills over into the other areas, because I mean I've seen people I've watched. I sometimes carry a newspaper and then go to carry it to a social place, and I've noticed that some even graduates actually have difficulty reading newspaper articles. I mean, these are, you find somebody, I mean, he has this area of specialization, is very good at that. He'll pick up material, written about that particular area and read it very easily, because, I mean, that's something familiar with him, to him rather. But he picks up a newspaper and there is difficulty. You can see it's actually reading it with difficulty, and I can just tell this gentleman here or this lady here has actually not done a lot of reading in other areas. I thank UBC, for the opportunity they've given me for this interview, and Fountain, secondly, and then of course I also have interacted very closely, and I consider them also to actually have made a huge contribution to my progress. FemRight, Uganda Women Writers Association, and my own family, because you see, if you don't get motivation from your family, you really cannot succeed at anything. Fountain Publishers, Fountain House, Nkrumah Road. But I mean, you can go to the internet. The contacts are there, email, phone contact. The Canadian publisher, the book hasn't yet arrived in the country. I just don't know. I think I'll have to find out what exactly is going on. But the moment it arrives, I think I'll get in touch with UBC so that that information can be passed around. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has been watching. Please read and encourage your children to read, because I mean, when you catch them early, yeah, I mean, reading is like a bug. It's just like once you catch it, it's something that you'll just have to you live with forever. Thank you.
UBC, inspiring Uganda.
Hello, people of God. I'm Reverend Dr. Arthur Magezi, and I have a series of teachings entitled I Am a Soldier. These teachings are on spiritual warfare and deliverance. Thank you again for watching. I am Reverend Dr. Arthur Magezi, and I'm sharing the series on I Am a Soldier from this book. In previous episodes, I shared about the hexagon of spiritual warfare, which is a summary of what I'm teaching about. And we've been talking about the dominant family spirit, which attacks leadership. Today, I want to start on the spirit of poverty, which attacks wealth. Now, before we proceed, let us have a word of prayer. that God may lead us. Father in heaven, we thank you for loving us so much that you are now teaching us how to have breakthrough. Lord, I pray that as we learn the truth, you will enable the truth to set us free. Now guide this teaching